Hey nerdy knitter, do you have piles of scraps of yarn laying around your house like this? I know I do. You might have boxes or bins or bags full of scraps of yarn that you'd like to use up. Well, in today's video, we're going to take that pile of scraps and turn it into a scrap blanket. I have a bunch of patterns for you today that are perfect for using up all of those leftovers. Be sure to stick around because I have some tips for organizing all of those leftover bits of yarn too, so you can hop right in and start a project right away. But before we jump into those patterns, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer. And my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. Now let's look at those patterns. One of my new favorites is the Safe at Home blanket, which is worked in garter stitch, but there's some interesting things going on here. We've got some stripes and a little bit of intarsia to put the door and the little windows on, but it's really simple and easy to do, and it's a great project to use up even the smallest bits of your yarn. And I love this one because you're only working on one strip at a time, so you don't have a big heavy blanket sitting on your lap that you have to add on to. You just work on a strip and then store it away and then work on another strip, and when you have a few done, you can start seaming them together until the blanket is as big as you want it to be. Of course, the pattern has some specific guidelines, but it's so easy to adjust for any size blanket. You could even make a pillow with smaller amounts of squares. Next is the memory blanket that uses garter stitch mitered squares. These are really simple to work, and instead of making individual squares and seaming them up, you're going to pick up stitches and continue adding onto the blanket. So if you don't like seams, then this is a good choice for you. Next we have the squared blanket. Now this one's still garter stitch as well, but you're working from the center out, and the completed squares are joined using a 3-needle bind off. And the pattern includes 3 different sizes, from a pillow all the way up to a throw. Another fun garter stitch blanket option is a log cabin blanket. Now there's lots of variations on this pattern, but I really like this one, and it includes some tips and tutorials and a video to show you how to pick up stitches and join each of the squares. Now you're not making individual squares, you make one and then you pick up stitches and you start the next one right on that edge, and then you just continue around until you have a completed square, and then you seam all of your squares together to make any size throw or blanket that you'd like. Now last in this section is the Stitch in Time blanket, which is another mitered square blanket, but the other mitered square blanket, the memory blanket, you would work a square and then pick up stitches and work the next square, so there was no seaming involved. Now this one, it makes smaller blocks, but if you don't like the weight of a heavy blanket on your lap, then this is a good option for mitered squares. You make smaller blocks and then you can add a border and make it any size you want as well. Now before we get to the next 5, why don't you leave a comment down below and tell me about your favorite scrap projects. Do you like to do scrap blankets, or do you have other ways that you use up your scraps and leftover bits of yarn? Now we'll move on to the next 5 patterns that are a step up from just basic garter stitch. Now those blankets were interesting and still had some interesting elements, but these take things a little bit further if you want something with a little more interest. Now this one's worked in Fisherman's Rib, which is a great squishy texture which would make a great blanket, and it's really simple to work, and the blanket also has an I-cord edging, and you'll even find video tutorials to help you with all of the steps through the pattern. Next is the Ultimate Knit Palette Blanket from Knit Picks. Now this uses every color in their palette line, but you certainly don't have to do that to make this full-size afghan. You can use your own stash of yarn. Each of the 5-inch squares only takes about 10 grams of yarn. They're worked from the center out, and then you add a border. Then once each of your squares is complete, you just seam them up together. Another good option for your scrap blanket is the Pop blanket, which uses colorful polka dots of color. Now each of these squares is also worked independently and then joined together, and each square uses 15 yards of your main color and then another 20 yards for your background color. And this one's easy to customize as well. You can just make more squares or less squares and make any size blanket you like. Next is the Beekeeper's quilt, and I think this one's just adorable. They're just little honeycomb shaped pockets of scraps that you can stuff or not stuff, and then each of them you just use quilt ties to put them together to make your blanket. So this is a great, perfect, portable, on-the-go project. It makes a beautiful finished blanket. Last on the list is Persian Dreams. Now this is a stunning blanket. It's on my to-do list. I'd really like to make one of these, but I think it's possible to make it with your scrap yarn. Each of the geometric shapes is done individually, so you could use up scraps for each one and then work them together when you're completed. But of course, it's a beautiful and stunning blanket and would be wonderful in a set palette of colors as well. So if you have a larger stash of leftovers, this might be a really good blanket to make with those. Now, if you have big piles of scraps laying around, I have a few tips for you to help you keep them organized. I think you should divide them up into a few categories. First, you should divide them by weight. And depending on what you have for scraps, you might have just one bin if you use a lot of medium worsted weight yarn, or you might use a lot of fingering or DK or sport. I would generally divide them up into 3 groups. Fingering by itself, and then DK and sport, I generally just put together for a blanket. And then worsted and Aran, I would put in another pile. Now, if you have bulky yarn, of course, you're gonna have to have a separate pile for that too. And then you also want to divide them up by their fiber content, because different fibers have different care needs. So divide them up into animal fibers and plant fibers. You don't have to go really any further than that for a scrap blanket unless you want to. And then when you find a pattern you like, you've got all of the yarn all sorted and ready to make your project. Now, if you have one of these piles laying around your house, grab one of these blanket patterns and sort your yarn and cast on today. You'll clear out some of your stash and have a beautiful handmade blanket when you're finished. You'll find links to all of these patterns down in the description box, as well as a link to an article with even more stash busting blanket ideas. And for more stash busting patterns, be sure to check out the video I've linked right here.